Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is Grant Cameron, and I'm continuing my series, episode 4, on the Stanton Friedman files that I reviewed last month at Fredericton, New Brunswick. Most of the files from the first batch of 6,000 photographs that I took are from documents from the 1980s. And what I'm going to be discussing today in my PowerPoint presentation is some material on the Roswell metamaterials. One particular document related to the alien autopsy controversy from 1995 that Stan did not believe the alien autopsy. He had a different view on it. I'm going to review one particular strange letter that he got from one of his fans, and he did get a lot of email from his fans. And I'm going to be discussing Dr. Eric Walker, who was a very prominent military academic who I was involved with in the 1980s, and Stanton's role and involvement with him. The final thing I'll be discussing is a file that Stan had on the UFO Cover-up Live, which was a documentary done a couple weeks before Reagan left the White House in 1988, which was broadcast live to Moscow, to the Soviet Union. And this was a documentary that introduced concepts such as the Avery, the Falcon, the Condor, the live alien, and a number of other ideas that had not been out there until they were in this documentary. And I discuss the results of how many people watched, and Stanton's look at the whole thing and how he viewed this documentary that he was involved with. So I'm going to go to the PowerPoint, so thanks, and hopefully you enjoy it.
This is Stanton Friedman Files, Episode 4. This is the archives again in Fredericton, New Brunswick, the provincial archives where this massive collection is housed. This was my desk here where I operated from in the main research room. There's huge numbers of files, as I've explained before. I'm just picking out as I go through them various files that I found kind of interesting. I have every day I did see date Friedman day 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and there were 6,000 images. So we're just picking up some of the highlights, and I should be going back whenever they've got some more material. So this is a massive file. You always got to keep this in mind when we're looking at this material. This is Stan Friedman, as I had mentioned before, was involved in almost every major subject. He was getting a lot of letters, and so he had to sort of keep up with everything in ufology. 1995, the alien autopsy breaks out, and he gets a letter from Bob Schell. He has a lot of material on the alien autopsy. Stan did not believe it. He believed, as this letter points out, he believed it was Turner's syndrome that this being on the film represented. That has probably been discounted by almost everybody. But this is a letter he gets that talks about a friend of Phil Klass, a guy named Bauer, who basically describes that he's a medical guy and says that the way they're holding the scissors and the scalpel and all this kind of stuff is all completely wrong. And so Shell is putting out an invite for people to sort of input material to help explain what's going on. This letter also refers to Roger Lear, who talked about the fact that the way the leg was being moved, he believed it was a real body and not a human one. So Stan and I will from time to time show some of the stuff that Stan was gathering on the alien autopsy. He did a lot of research on it. This is an interesting one. The atom project with To the Stars is very popular now. People are doing a lot of talking about various pieces of metal that have been recovered, and whether this can help us build a flying saucer and explain or prove that UFOs are extraterrestrial. I will maintain still that I think a lot of this is port material, that this is stuff that's purposely being dropped. And the prime example is the Maury Island case, which is the first one, which is repeated over and over again in ufology, where the UFO looks like it's going to crash, gets the attention of all the people on the ground. They're all watching. They think the thing's going to crash, and suddenly there's an explosion and a bunch of metal rains down. I really fail to believe that a flying saucer can fly across the galaxy and then little pieces start falling off it. Now, because Stan was involved in the Roswell thing and trying to verify some hard evidence that Roswell took place, he was getting reports of metal, and he was also getting actual metal. This is one piece that he got. And the letter states, this is from the Roswell. This is the Roswell fragment that I mentioned you about, or told you about. So Stan had this, and it doesn't appear that it was analyzed. It was just in a file. He had the metal with the letter, and like many researchers, Stan would have had way too much material to analyze in the time that he had. So this was there, and it's one of now about a half dozen items that I've asked the archives to sort of put under seal, to only show with an archivist there that this metal can easily disappear. And I said at this point, I wouldn't advise them to allow any of this metal to be analyzed until they're absolutely certain that it's going to be done properly and that they will get the piece back. This is my own piece, which I really didn't take too seriously till a couple of days ago. This is a piece of metal that comes from what's called the gifting field. If you read Diane Pasulka's book, American Cosmic, she talks about an area who her friend Tyler D., an astronaut from, or an engineer from NASA, takes her and Gary Nolan to this site with special metal detectors, and they pick up stuff, and some of the material apparently is very strange. And I had met Tyler D. in 2013. I know who he is, and it was actually my friend here in Winnipeg who took Tyler D. to the site, and that's when he discovered this gifting field site. And my friend had pieces as well. So this is a piece that my friend had. He gave it to me. He said he really didn't need it then. He suddenly decided he wanted it back. And he said, you can cut off a small piece and I'd like it back. So I'm really not interested in this kind of stuff. So I cut off a little tiny sliver off the one side and put it back to him. The thing is, this is coming from the same area in New Mexico where Tyler D. took these two people and blindfolded them. And I just got a request a couple of days ago from somebody else who had material from the gifting field and had done analysis, I believe, at MIT and one other university, and it showed that it was had strange properties. So they were asking me about it, and I said, well, yeah, I know exactly which field it is. I know where it is. I've got a piece. And so they sent me photographs, and the piece that you see here is a complete match to the stuff they have. So I've tried to put the two guys together. Whether Tyler D. will talk about this or whether they're not interested in sharing the data or whatever. But this was kind of strange that I never really took this piece seriously. And now suddenly there's two reports of the fact that material coming out of the field where this came out of is showing very strange properties. This is a letter that Stan, I don't know where he got it from, but it's 1996, and it's from NIDS. And it's to Max Lytle, who was the third director of the Roswell Museum, about a piece that he had received at the museum. And this is a letter from NIDS talking about the test of the material, about how he has to verify that there's actually, it actually goes back to the Roswell crash, the conditions as to how they're going to test this kind of stuff. And this was sent back to Lytle. Max actually was quoted in one of the articles that was done at, he was the, as they have here, as the Secretary and Treasurer of the International UFO Museum at Roswell. And he said that the media can be ruthless, overbearing, and rude in pursuing those who claim to have seen aliens. He said that's why he won't say who gave the museum a sliver of the metal said to have been picked up near the site where something crashed in 1947. The sliver of metal, about 1/100th of an inch thick, has been analyzed at the New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology and determined to be made of copper with silver plating. He said he doesn't know if it's otherworldly. And so Stan has a file on this piece and some newspaper articles and stuff, but there was no sort of resolution as to what NIDS discovered or what actually happened to this piece. And it may be in another file, but it wasn't in the main file that talked about this Roswell piece. In terms of the NIDS analysis, this is a document that I actually put on the internet. This is from the Edgar Mitchell collection. The first two documents went up were the, and that was not by me, was the alien autopsy document and the Admiral Tom Wilson, Eric Davis notes. And so when this conspiracy theory started, I put out this document to sort of point people to the fact that this did come out of the Edgar Mitchell file. And one of the things that's interesting in this letter, this is an invite to Edgar Mitchell from Bob Bigelow to attend meetings that are taking place in 1996. There was, I believe, 6 meetings a year. He would bring in all these high-level people to sit on the board and to discuss various subjects. And one of the subjects, as you can see from this letter, Bigelow writes, since the last meeting, we have engaged in metallurgic analysis of selected samples that were made available to us. The results of that analysis is scheduled to be made available very soon. A report will be provided at the meeting. The process has enabled NIDS to establish a working relationship with Los Alamos Laboratories for conducting such analysis and obtaining formal written reports from them. I am told the reports will be on their letterhead and signed by the scientists doing the analysis. Now, it may be because John Alexander was sort of the main guy that was brought in by Bob Bigelow to run NIDS in the early days. That may be why they're using Los Alamos. And the other thing to point out is that this letter, 1996, is the same year as this piece that I just talked about that was provided by Max Littell. Stan had a lot of these kind of things. This is very, he would get these various things, what famous people had said about UFOs. And there's a couple of interesting ones here that, and Stan would bring these up all the time in lectures and then sort of show, as he quotes at the bottom, none of the above quotes are supported by data or references. All are demonstrably false. And these were from skeptics that Stan would take on in terms of arguing about the UFO phenomena. The first one is Sagan, and this is a fairly common one that Sagan used to use. The reliable cases are uninteresting, and the interesting cases are unreliable. Unfortunately, there are no cases that are both reliable and interesting. The second one is Isaac Asimov, who wrote this, and I'd never heard this one before. Almost every sighting is either a mistake or a hoax. These reports are so riddled with hoaxes, and the flying saucer enthusiasts have so many cranks, freaks, and nuts among them that Hynek is constantly running the risk of innocently damaging his reputation by being associated with them. And then Dr. Donald Menzel, who Stan took on numerous times and actually went to get his files at Harvard University, got special permission, went through all his files. All non-explained sightings are from poor observers. So Stan would gather these things, and you'd find them all over the place in his lectures, in his debates, and he liked to gather these sort of quotes from various people. And then he would from that, he would get his rules for UFO debunkers, which most people have heard him talk about. Don't bother me with the facts, my mind is made up. But the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. If you can't attack the data, attack the people. It's easier. Do research by proclamation, because investigation is too much trouble. And he would, every time he would get into a debate with one of these guys, he would bring up these sort of rules that he had. And when you look at the research done by Skeptics, you see that Stan was pretty much on the mark with the people that I've sort of interacted with. They have silly quotes, all these sort of ones from Richard Weaver, who wrote the Roswell report. Stan was fighting against this Roswell report that had been put out by the U.S. Air Force during the the Clinton administration. And again, he would use these quotes and go after these people repeatedly for statements they had made trying to debunk UFOs. This is an interesting one that I found. Stan, and this is one of the things the archives has sort of wanted me to sort of avoid, is Stan got apparently a lot of fan mail from various people who had heard his lectures, and he could pack in 600,000 people at university lectures all over the world. And so he got a lot of mail, and they basically aren't too worried about a lot of the stuff getting out, but they're concerned about the people who may have written sort of a fan letter to Stan, that their identities sort of not be made public. So here's a funny one from, he gets one from prison, which is it starts off, and it looks like a sort of a prison letter where the guy's writing to Stan, and he's sort of saying where he's being held and stuff. And he gets to start about, he's telling Stan about his sightings. So you have this guy in prison having a sighting. My fourth sighting was many years later. It was on or about Sunday, October the 27th, 1985, at approximately 2:15 a.m. I was sitting in the Eastern Correctional Institute 4 unit, whatever that is, where I was assigned to the East Wing, room number 7. Down. The lights were off, and I was sitting in a chair looking out of the room window, listening to radio. Suddenly, this big round object came into view. I assumed at first it was the moon, but then I realized that the thing was moving. So he tells this whole sighting, whatever, and you would figure, well, it's just, it doesn't really count because it comes from a prisoner. But the guy actually, it's a long letter, and the guy actually draws this thing. He's got all sorts of drawings, and here's one of the drawings that he provided, and he has lots of details on what he saw. And you would say, well, you can disregard the letter because the guy came from prison, but it's probably the only UFO letter I've ever seen that actually comes notarized. He actually has the letter actually notarized by a notary public. So very interesting that Stan would get all these letters from everybody that you could possibly think of in society. Stan got reports, the Rhodesia, the school sighting at the Zimbabwe, 1994. Stan got a report there, and I've put this on the internet on my Facebook site for people who want to see it. It's actually pretty interesting. It talks about all the other sightings that occurred with these 62 school kids, and there was other sightings in Zimbabwe during that time period. And this was a report that was done by Cynthia Hind, Stan had gotten this. And I want to read a little section from the last bit. Here's the RUWA sighting at the school with the 62 kids. And the second page the report was kind of interesting. The smaller children from 5 to 7 years old were very frightened at the time and ran shouting, "Help me, help me." When the older children asked why they were saying this, the reply was, "He's coming to eat us." And then they said she figured this applied to Black African children because they had these legends of these beings eating children. The teachers were in a meeting but did not come out. When I queried the headmaster about this, he said the children always shouted and yelled during playtime and no one thought there was anything unusual going on. The only other adult available at the time was one of the mothers who was running the tuck shop. When the children came to call her, she did not believe them and would not come out. She was not prepared to leave the shop with all the food and the money. So Stan gets this. It's kind of an interesting report from the time period. And Cynthia Hine was the first to go in there and actually do the investigation. She was from South Africa. Stanton Friedman, this is an interesting one because this actually involves me. Stan Friedman actually was involved with Dr. Eric Walker, who was the former president of Penn State University, who I and a number of researchers chased around for a number of years. And then I put out a book with all the transcripts of all the things he had told us and what we had sort of gotten his background and stuff, which was called UFOs, MJ-12 and the Government, which was the first book that was actually published by MUFON in 1990. So Stan heard that I was working on this case, and he actually makes 2 phone calls. I believe it was 2 phone calls with Dr. Eric Walker. Walker played games with him, didn't really tell him anything, sort of made fun of Roswell and stuff. And Stan sort of got very frustrated, and he basically said to me, so what? I mean, leave the guy alone. I mean, maybe he knows, maybe he, but he's not going to talk. So it's totally waste of time to basically go after him. So Stan gave up, but Bill Moore, who I knew in the 1980s, and I will always give Bill Moore credit for this, that Bill Moore said, I don't really believe that he is who you think he is, but I'm going to send a friend of mine in, and I'm going to find out for sure exactly what this guy knows. And I'll describe that in a second, the incident. So here's Dr. Eric Walker. This was actually taken when he was Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon. And this is when this meeting took place where they had a downed craft, and that they had a series of briefings at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to describe the discoveries they had made in terms of the craft and the beings. And a bunch of people from Washington had been invited. And we learned about it because Stanton Friedman had interviewed Dr. Robert Sarbacher, and Sarbacher said he couldn't go to these briefings, but he said Walker had gone. Walker was very arrogant. He thought he knew everything, and he had been at all the meetings, and he would be able to tell you what happened. So Stanton makes the contact. He's basically sort of blown off by Walker. And then we have this. This is a letter Stan sends to Chris Rakowski, who is a researcher, UFO researcher. And he and I both worked at the University of Manitoba for many, many decades. And Chris started about the same time as me, the Carmen sightings in 1975. And this is a letter from Stanton Friedman to Chris Rakowski. And he's talking about me. So he's here. He says, I hear rumblings about Cameron and Bill, which is Bill Moore, and Eric Walker. It would be nice to get someone on record regarding MJ-12 if that is possible. And so the reference he's making is that when I went to Bill Moore said, well, I really don't believe this, but I'm going to send someone. And what he did is he sent in Dr. Kit Green, who has now become sort of famous in terms of some of the documents that are coming out and some of the To the Stars stuff. But Kit Green's been around the whole time, and he actually was the guy that Bill Moore told me, he says, I'm going to send in BJ. He didn't tell me who it was, but I knew about the Avery, and that was the Blue Jay, who was Kit Green. So he said, I'm sending him in, and it took quite a while. It took about 6 months for him to go in there, and I never was informed what happened. I heard rumors about what had happened in the meeting at Penn State, because Walker, as former president of Penn State, had he was president emeritus and had still kept right till his death. He had an office at Penn State. And so they had sent Kit Green to go and talk to him. This is my co-author who wrote the book with me, Scott Crane, who lives and actually graduated from journalism at Penn State University. So we chased Walker around, and Scott, after Walker died, I went and looked at all the files, and Scott actually talked to the son, and the son had actually confirmed that yes, there was a UFO file. We knew he had a UFO file on us because he kept sending one of our letters he would send letters to different researchers, photocopy them, and then send them to different researchers and sort of play these crazy games that he was playing. So we knew he was keeping the letters and he was photocopying them and stuff. And the son, who was a medical doctor, actually confirmed after Walker died that when he took the files, to Penn State University, there was a file that had two crashes, and he said one was Pennsylvania, one was a Western crash. He really didn't read the material, and that when he moved the files, the last files from the house that Walker had there to the archives, that file was no longer there. So Kit Green goes in, and it's mentioned in Jacques Vallee's new book, his volume 4 of Forbidden Science. And this basically details what happened. Now, you got to remember, I was never told. It was my story, and Kit Green went in there, but a lot of this stuff is kept in the group. So Kit Green would tell Hal Puthoff and other people about what had happened, and Bill Moore, but nobody ever related back to me what actually happened. So here's the meeting with Dr. Walker. And this is Jacques Vallee talking, and Kit Green is sort of hyping Dr. Walker and saying, you know, have you ever heard of this guy? You'd be in awe of the man. He was Dean of Engineering at Harvard, co-founder of the Academy of Engineering and Sciences, chairman of the Defense Science Board, former head of the Jasons, science advisor to the president, former chairman of TRW, goes on and on. And one of the letters that he had sent us was this letter where he was being shown the MJ-12 document, and he got very upset, and he said, you know, most of the stuff you have is wrong. How do you know they all died? Most of the stuff you have is assumption, and it's all wrong. And he laughed. And so he put out this letter, which we thought was just sort of like a fake playing game letter, where he sort of refers to the fact that some of the aliens survived and that they were moved into society. So they're talking about here, and so Kit starts telling the story about to Jacques Vallee, the fact that he was sent to talk to Dr. Walker, and here's how he says, he still has an office on the campus, so I went to see him. I made it clear that I had an official portfolio and clearance to talk to him. He asked me two questions: why was I interested, and why I thought the information should be made public. And he would say that to us as well. Well, why should I, and how did he put it? Why should I violate the rules to satisfy your curiosity? He always had this thing, why should we make this thing public? I told him my interests stemmed from concern about misinformation circulating in the media, and that I wasn't sure the data should be made public. Those must have been the wrong answers, because he flatly refused to confirm or deny that he had made the comments in question or written the letters. He'd written a lot of letters to us, and they were all sort of rhymes and riddles and stuff, but I'm sure he wrote them. So Jacques Vallee asked him, what else did he tell you? Damn little. When I asked him, and I remember this part of the rumor I heard this part, damn little. When I asked him what could make him change his mind, he said, bring me a letter from the president instructing me to talk to you about that stuff, and I'll call the president and I'll make sure it is from him. So I said, perhaps those letters that are circulating over your signature are not really from you. Perhaps they are forgeries. He wouldn't discuss it. And would I please leave his office immediately? By the way, he frequently travels to Russia. He's close friends of Armand Hammer. And that's what I heard too, that basically Kit Green was basically thrown out of the office, and Walker simply would not talk. And yet after this meeting took place, other people continued to contact Walker, and he would talk to other people. Even after we sort of outed the fact that he was talking to all these people and put complete transcripts of all the interviews that he'd done with various people, he still continued to talk. This is another one that and this again is something where I didn't realize that I was sort of the Walker expert, and I didn't realize that Hal Puthoff had actually talked to Walker as well. So they were getting these reports that Walker was talking to various researchers, that we were documenting this stuff. And so in 1991, Hal Puthoff writes to Dr. Eric Walker, and he's asking about the zero-point energy and his various things, and Walker actually replies. So Jacques Vallee writes in his volume 4, Hal has received a polite response to his letter of May 14th to Eric Walker, suggesting a dialogue about UFO propulsion. Walker replied that he was impressed with Hal's research on zero-point energy and relativist models of anomalous phenomena, but he added, "You will learn very little from spending much time on what you call some of the more bizarre claimed observations in the UFO field. It seems to me that other approaches would be more fruitful." Now, whether there was any other correspondence or whether Walker clarified what he was talking about, but I did not know that Hal had been in contact with him. Here's another one where there's another guy that I always said that people should pay attention to, and that was Dick D'Amato. Dick D'Amato, in the way I heard the story, was in 1990 when the Area 51 story was breaking. Senator Byrd on the Appropriations Committee that hands out the money for the U.S. government had asked his colleagues, are we doing UFOs at Area 51? And if we are, like, we don't know what the hell's going on. We're paying for this thing. And so they sent Dick D'Amato to Area 51. They sent him to talk to John Lear and Huff and George Knapp and Bob Lazar, and he apparently actually got on the base and did not get any confirmation, but he had come back and made this very famous statement, pulling Jesse Marcel Jr. into a conference room at the under the Congress building in Washington, and told him, "This is for real." Referring to MJ-12, referring to Roswell, this is not fiction. There is a government, there's a group that's not part of the government that has unlimited money and unlimited power. And so from then I knew that Dick D'Amato was a guy that you had to watch. And this is one of the things that is related to the Walker thing that, and I have to find out whether Stanton talked to Dick D'Amato, but Jacques Vallee talks about D'Amato, and it's actually pretty interesting. So I'll throw it in here. I know where I've heard of your name, said Kit. You were involved in the review of the SRI psychic work. And then D'Amato said that he was now funding the project himself and had actually written the research into legislation and was hoping to get it into, he would funded it. So here we have, it's a long conversation. So I would suggest people to buy Vallee's book 4. It's extremely interesting. He sort of confirms a lot of the stuff that I was getting back in the 1980s and 90s. But here at the end, I want to read just this last paragraph where there's a summation by Vallee. In summary, the secret project is illegal. It isn't within the government agency. It is small. It generates high-level leaks designated to infect the research community with false data, and the cover makes it look bigger than it really is. Not bad for one meeting. So they're having this discussion, and what I always refer to, people always want to play the conspiracy game, but I say when you're talking about Kit Green and Hal Puthoff and all these people, they're basically doing the same thing I'm doing. So I realize that they know more than I do, and I listen very carefully to what they say, and they do the same thing. So when they got Dick D'Amato a chance to talk to him for 4 hours, they tried to pick his brain, knowing that he knew more than they did, because he was this legal counsel for the Senate Appropriations Committee and had been given unlimited clearances to get access to material from people involved with the crash saucer program and with the Area 51 thing, and basically said to Jesse Marcel, it's for real. Jesse said, well, when are you going to release it? He said, if it were up to me, it's not up to me. I'm just here to determine what the security is costing. But he did get some material. He was able to confirm that this control group existed, and that there was a very active program on the crash saucer material. So here's another one. After a quick lunch, D'Amato left in a hurry to get back to the Hill. Kit Green relaxed, ordered more coffee, and told me, Jacques Vallee, I know where I've heard of him at the agency. He's got a good reputation, but he's typical of all those Senate staffers who think they know everything. The world just doesn't work that way. Now, Jacques Vallee talks again about in here, and he talks about a lot of very interesting inside people, the Avery people, and Ron Pandolfi, and a bunch of very interesting behind-the-scenes stories that confirm the stuff that I was getting. And he talks about Dr. Eric Walker's death in 1995. So he basically says, you know, Bill Steinman reported he had validation of the statements that Walker was making, but Walker wouldn't confirm or deny that to Kit, that 4 aliens had been picked up and that 1 had survived. Steinman actually pulled out very early. He thought he got threatened, and he had some religious problems with the research, and he'd done a lot of research, and he just sort of one day packed it up and left and never came back. So it was actually myself and T. Scott Crane who actually continued the research and tried to verify who Walker was and what did he know. Now here's Stanton Friedman on Roswell. This is kind of an interesting small letter here. He has a photograph of the Roswell site. I'm pretty sure there's a Roswell site. There's a number of these photographs in there. They really didn't explain what they were, but he had that. And this is the gifting field, that piece I showed earlier in the presentation. This is Tyler D's gifting field in New Mexico. This is the second crash site where they had these special detectors and we're picking up pieces of metal there. And there are 2 groups working on analyzing, as far as I know, the material that's coming out of this field. Stanton Friedman turned down. Stanton contacted a lot of people. That's one thing you realize that he did. He was very good at using phone books and finding old people who were at Roswell in 1947. Here's one of the letters where he actually sort of gets turned down by one of the Roswell witnesses. He says, "Dear Mr. Friedman, I'm responding to your letter of October the 23rd, asking for information I might have regarding salvage or investigation of an unidentified flying object recovered near Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. I believe I had communication from you several months ago. I ignored it. I apologize. However, I have no firsthand knowledge, nor do I recall any rumors of any such activity during my tour at Roswell Air Force Base. I was stationed at Roswell from 1945 till 1950. I do not want my name used in any way in connection with your research of events that have occurred at or near Roswell." Got a lot of dead ends as well. He would get a lot of letters where they weren't returned. Here's a where he goes to the Roswell newspaper, and he gets the famous copy of the Roswell Daily Record from 1947. And here's the reporter from the Record talking to him and sending him the photograph, which has become kind of a famous Stanton photograph of him looking at the Roswell report in the Roswell newspaper. And they took this photograph, and Stan used that many, many times. Here is, not sure what this, this has got to do with research. There was some work going back between Randall Schmidt and Carey and Stanton, and some of this correspondence between these guys was going back and forth. Here's one, and this was another controversial document. Everybody knows about the MJ-12 document that was sort of leaked in the 1980s. The other one that was leaked was called the Carter Briefing, and Stan was trying to get a verification of this as well. This was one where Bill Moore was forced to fly from airport to airport on his own money. He paid for his own tickets. Go on a telephone, get on another plane, go to that airport, get on the telephone, go to another airport. And they flew him around the country and then put him in and it ended up in a hotel room. The guy came in with an envelope and he said, "You've got, I think it was 17 minutes. You can do whatever you want." And Bill Moore starts to photograph this document, which became known as the Carter Briefing, which was supposedly a notes of the briefing that was given to Jimmy Carter as president-elect. And so Stan actually sends this document out to some people. He sent it to Clifford Stone, and he's basically asking him, what do you know about this? Have you seen it? And then goes to the whole idea, which is kind of funny with Stan, he had the mailbox in Maine to save money. And he said he reminds Stone that the letter will be coming from the United States because a letter to the United States is 30 cents, but if you mail it in the United States, it's 20 cents. So Stan would get, his wife would go shopping across the border. She would take all the mail and mail it in the United States. Stan was involved in this famous UFO Cover-up live show, which happened in October of 1988, a couple of weeks before Ronald Reagan left office. And the rumor at the time was that Reagan had authorized this production, and this is where the introduction takes place of the live alien, the alien that likes to have strawberry ice cream, and the idea of the Avery, the Condor, and the Falcon. That all starts in this UFO Cover-up live. They have a number of high-level people there, and Stan had a big file on this. He was very upset about it. At first, he was kind of excited about it, but then you see in the file he gets sort of very excited. And this was had taken place. It was a live broadcast done in the United States and live in the Soviet Union at the same time. You got to remember, this is the Cold War was still going on before the fall of the Soviet Union. So here is the sort of, you see Stan's itinerary. They're telling him where he's going to be staying, how this all works. And here is the press release, which talks about the fact that Mike Farrell, who was with the show MASH, is going to be hosting the special, and they're going to have this live feed to the Soviet Union. And it was very much hyped. I remember talking to Billy Cox at Florida Today at the time, and we were trying to anticipate what they were going to do. There was even a story circulating in 1988 that the live alien would appear on camera with Ronald Reagan, and this was going to be disclosure, which of course never happened. But there was all sorts of rumors surrounding this documentary. It was very, very hyped at the time. And so you see Stan is been involved in this, and he's making arrangements to go there. The thing actually had very bad ratings. This is not in the days of the internet, so you had one night to run the thing, and either it went or it didn't go. There was a Boston Celtics basketball game, so it didn't run until about midnight in Boston. They got very low ratings there. One of the things I do, and Stan has all the letters of the articles that talk about the reaction. One of the interesting things was they had a live call-in where you could pay, I think it was 75 cents, and you could phone in, or $1, and you could report your UFO sightings. And they registered 75,000 phone calls on that night, the people that paid $1 to phone in their UFO sightings. So they did get 75,000 calls, and I'm not sure where the files of those calls are or who had them. Here's another one talking about the bad ratings that they got, that it was kind of messed up. The interesting thing to me was always the fact that they had put out this indirect material that was plausible deniability, the idea of the live alien, the idea of the Condor, the Falcon. And one of the other interesting things that happened is I was recently contacted by the girl of the producer for this thing. And she said, I've got the files from the whole thing. And she said it was to sort of discredit the UFO thing. They were trying to tell a real story, and there was these people in there that were messing it up, and people had to read off cue cards and all this kind of stuff. So it was very interesting. And then she said, and it was at my house where John Burroughs was regressed. And I said, really? And so I told John, I said, I'm in contact with the girl, is the daughter of the producer, and your regression took place. And John sort of freaked out and said, I need you to send everything she's sending to me, and don't read it, and whatever. And then he phoned the girl's father, who was the producer. And then she contacted me. She said, oh, John contacted my father, and my father asked me, what are you up to? What are you doing? And so she sort of went quiet after that, really didn't. So I really didn't get some of the stuff, but she has all the files. It was kind of an interesting moment in time where she was describing what was actually going on behind the scenes in this documentary that was done on major US TV in 1988. Again, here's Moore versus Phil Klass, some of this very funny correspondence between these guys fighting here. Phil Klass writes to Bill Moore. I'm writing to reply to your letter of July the 6th because a psychiatrist friend urged me to do so after reading your letter. And Bill Moore had claimed that Phil Klass had threatened him. So at the very end of the letter, he said, finally, because you claim that you cannot show anybody a copy of my January the 10th, 1984 threat letter without my permission, I hereby grant such permission providing you show the complete letter. I encourage you to show the letter at every opportunity. But first, please show it to the FBI. So we have these fights going back and forth and claims and counterclaims. So here's Bill Moore writing back to him, and Bill had very sarcastic sort of way of dealing with Phil Klass. He said, thank you for a most recent letter, June the 21st, in which you fulfill my prediction that you would be totally unable to bring yourself to deal with any of my real issues raised in my previous letters. I've got to hand it to you, Phil. When it comes to making a fool of yourself, you are truly an expert. But then, come to think of it, I guess an old fogey like you has nothing better to do with his declining years. As for your alleged new book, will you have to grovel at Martin Gardner's feet to get this one published too, or have you managed to con someone more reputable into doing it? Perhaps you should try Marvel Comics. They're always looking for a way out literature, and the characters fit right in with your personality type: murderers, con artists, wackos, etc., etc. All in the name of good, clean fun, of course. Don't you just love my sense of humor? And here's another one that Bill has where he writes to Phil. Phil, if you had even half a brain, you would be dangerous. As it is, you are nothing but a pathetic, egotistical, psychotic nuisance. I feel sorry for you. The need to belittle others, to ridicule their philosophies and beliefs, and to cast aspersions upon their personal lives in order to make yourself appear important has long been recognized as a symptom of severe mental derangement. You live on puffery, Phil Klass. You feed on your own ego. You must continually convince yourself that you are somebody in order to keep going. And the funny thing about it is this actually inspired Klass. He would fire back, and so these guys would insult each other left, right, and center. But they would continue this correspondence went on basically for like a decade. He says, you have a severe problem, Phil Klass. When you finally come to realize it, we will be all better off. I predict, however, that you will die first. But then the result is basically the same in either case, isn't it? Do enjoy your reclining years. And then we have, and I've mentioned this in previous broadcasts, the other guy that was involved in this whole letter battle, and you got to remember this, there's no internet, so this is happening by surface mail, is Jim Moseley. And Jim Moseley would sort of sit on the sidelines, and Jim Moseley, everything was a joke. So he stirs it up here. So he's writing to Bill Moore. He says, Bill, thanks for sending me your copy of your letter to Phil Klass. Klass also sent it to me, together with a copy of his reply. I wrote him suggesting that a panel of 3 psychiatrists should be chosen to decide which of you is crazy or crazier. One would be chosen by each of you, and one neutral observer, such as myself, maybe. Then the results of the analysis of the 3 shrinks would be put into a paper to be read at the next MUFON conference or the PsyCop gathering. Klass turned the idea down, and I guess you will too. So he was sitting there and putting these sort of barbs into each of them, and wrote saucer smear, and these guys would all fight in saucer smear, and it was kind of an exciting time. Again, Stanton Friedman with the Skeptics. This is the last one, and I'll leave it at this for this presentation. One of the people who's been sort of identified as a debunker, UFO debunker, is Cal Korff, and he is now sort of becoming public with a case. He's involved in the Pandolfi lawsuit case. I've just written an article on it, which is on my Facebook site, Presidential UFO. And I remember the last time I saw Stanton Friedman was in January of this year in California. And we went for breakfast, and I mentioned to him the fact that Cal Korff had just done a radio broadcast where he said that he was going to take down the Betty and Barney Hill case. So this would have been, I saw it Stan in January, so this would have been late last year when he did this broadcast. And Stan looked at me puzzled. He said, he's going to what? And I said, he claims he's going to take down the Betty and Barney Hill case, which of course Stan had co-authored a book with Kathy Marden. And so he said, well, I'm going to have to tell Kathy about that. And then he was very quiet. And then he just looked at me and he said, I helped get that guy started when he was very young. I helped get that guy going. And he sort of seemed very sort of upset with himself that he had not seen it coming, that he had actually sort of encouraged this guy to go. And now this guy was claiming that he was going to take down one of Stanton's main cases, the Betty and Barney Hill abduction case. So I'll leave it at that. And thanks for listening.